Thanks for joining us today on the third webinar in our 10-part series on CNU's Highways to Boulevards initiative. Today's webinar is Traffic Engineering for Advocates, a very pragmatic and popular subject for urban freeway removal advocates. This webinar is made possible by a generous grant from the Ford Foundation, who has been immensely supportive of CNU's project for transportation reform. The Congress for the New Urbanism is the leading organization promoting walkable, mixed-use neighborhood development, sustainable communities, and healthier living conditions. If you're interested in learning more about CNU's Highways to Boulevards initiative, please visit cnu.org/highways to learn more. Before we get started, if you have any questions during today's presentation, please use the chat feature in the bottom right corner of your browser window. We'll try to address as many questions as we can in the hour. So, advocates of urban freeway removal often struggle to make effective traffic arguments simply because they are not traffic engineers themselves. In fact, many times advocates are making a case against the recommendations of traffic engineers at the state level. That need not be the case. Today, we're joined by two innovative transportation advocates, both of whom are active CNU members and who work towards smart transportation investment. Together, they will address this struggle of traffic arguments, giving you as advocates a set of tools and ideas to more confidently approach traffic impact analyses as they relate to urban freeway removal and boulevard conversion. So Norm Marshall, principal of Smart Mobility, will share two case studies from freeway removal sites he's worked on in the US. But up first is Jeff Tumlin, an expert in multi-modal planning and principal at Nelson Nygaard. Jeff, I'll let you take it from here. Hey, Jeff, we're having trouble hearing you. Try going up to the upper right or upper middle and hitting select microphone. Yep, yeah. Perfect.
All right, there we go. Should I start over again?
Yes, please, thanks.
Okay. So once again, my name is Jeff Tumlin, and I have two confessions. The first is that I am not a traffic engineer, although some of my best friends are. Secondly, I was born in Los Angeles, and I got my driver's license on the day of my 16th birthday. I love driving, but I also recognize that freeways are not always the best solution, either for cities or for our motorists. And in fact, if we look at Los Angeles, a city famous for its freeways, and observe that the parts of Los Angeles with by far the greatest real estate values, as well as the greatest economic productivity, is the swath of the west side that extends from downtown to Hollywood, Beverly Hills, Westwood, Century City, Santa Monica. There's effectively two freeways serving this entire mega region. And particularly when we compare Los Angeles at the same scale to other cities like Kansas City, we can see that there may be an inverse relationship between our investment in freeways in cities and their economic productivity and livability. Particularly when we compare also with the same scale to cities like Vancouver, arguably the most livable modern city in the world. Vancouver has, well, they claim that they have no freeways. They actually have some fragments of freeways, but they're planning on removing those in the coming year. This is San Francisco at the same scale. The red freeways are those that were built. The yellow ones were ones that were planned in the 1940s and 1950s, but were not built as a result of San Francisco's very famous freeway revolt in the 1960s and 1970s. These freeways were removed, and the city is currently considering removing these additional freeways, recognizing that for urban places, freeways create more harm than good. Nonetheless, San Francisco, like most American cities, had very ambitious freeway plans in the 1940s and 50s, blanketing the city, including multiple freeways running through and across Golden Gate Park, connecting all of the bridges and all of the neighborhoods, and wiping out many neighborhoods and neighborhood commercial districts. So the revolts that started really as early as the 1950s, but got their steam in the 60s and really prevailed in the early 1970s, prevented a lot of freeways from being built, but only after a great deal of harm was already done. This is the San Francisco Ferry Building. You can see the Embarcadero Freeway on the right, cutting off San Francisco from its waterfront. It was, unfortunately, along with several freeways in the region, damaged in the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989. The earthquake that broke the Bay Bridge also did severe damage to several of the region's freeways. San Francisco, unlike other cities in the region, decided to take advantage of the damage that was done to the freeways and actually demolish them. The Embarcadero Freeway removal began in 1991. And it opened up the city's waterfront and dramatically increased not only public access, but real estate values and development opportunities, allowing for a completely new waterfront in San Francisco that is now creating controversy because of just how attractive a development site and major regional public destination that it is. But the space now in front of the Ferry Building is spectacularly beautiful. The Ferry Building itself is a renowned food hall for local produce and restaurants. But very interestingly, just in the decade after the freeway was removed, the total number of housing units along the Embarcadero increased by about 54%, with a significant increase in jobs, in walking, in transit utilization, and very importantly, home values. Just in that decade after the freeway was removed, home values increased by over $100,000 per unit relative to the regular ongoing increase elsewhere in San Francisco real estate values. A more interesting freeway, however, than the Embarcadero was the Central Freeway. The Central Freeway ran through mostly working class neighborhoods in the Civic Center area, including a major structure that crossed Market Street, a double-decker, massive facility cutting both through a residential neighborhood, a neighborhood commercial district that was really struggling, as well as cutting off Market Street. That freeway was removed and replaced by a surface-level boulevard, Octavia Boulevard, which looks roughly like this. It's now being lined with housing. And it's an interesting story in the complicated politics of the Central Freeway removal. It went for 3 public votes, where the vote swung one way, then the other, then back again, with a third vote voting to demolish it in 1999, which was then completed in 2003. The freeway itself carried about 90,000 cars per day. The replacement Octavia Boulevard carried only about half of that. And so as a result, of course, the traffic engineers predicted that removing the freeway would cause gridlock all the way from San Francisco to Sacramento, about 150 miles away. And as usual with these things, the engineers were baffled when the freeway was removed and there was no gridlock and nobody could quite figure out why. But the freeway removal had other dramatic impacts, including the usual significant increase in home values, and a dramatic increase in the number of housing units, since the freeway parcels, the land that was freed up by the freeway, are all being built in housing over the last 15 years. However, with the Central Freeway removal, the land value increase was so dramatic that it also raised some concerns, particularly around social equity. There was a significant shift in the ethnic makeup of the neighborhood before and after the freeway. And it created a very interesting conversation in San Francisco about how to capture real estate value increases by improvements in the public realm, while at the same time protecting established low-income residents, as well as securing the cultural institutions that allow for and support ethnicities of many types, recognizing that the city is going to continue to change, but to make sure that the decision-making about that change is deliberate and comes from within the neighborhood. There was also a fair amount of analysis that was done about what happened to all the displaced freeway traffic. Basically, the street grid worked, and while there was a relatively modest mode shift, at least in the short term after the freeway removal, what we found is that the city's street grid was incredibly effective at being able to absorb the traffic and allow motorists to continue to get to some freeway, but by some other means. And so the result is a beautiful facility, still carries a significant amount of traffic, but creates a fantastic new neighborhood. The Octavia Boulevard terminates at what's now one of the most beloved parks in San Francisco. It's called Patricia's Green, after Patricia Walkup, who was one of the neighborhood activists most instrumental in creating the political case to have the freeway removed. It's a very popular park. There's a children's playground that sits at the terminus of this major arterial. It is safe and beloved by the residents. And it's especially beloved by the residents living where they used to have the freeway right outside their window. They now have a major arterial outside their window, but the major through lanes of Octavia Boulevard are separated from the residential frontages by this quiet side access lane that creates a little bit additional space, a little additional sound protection, and a significant improvement in the quality of walking in the neighborhood, even as we accommodate fairly high speed and certainly high volume motor vehicle traffic. So other things that we think about when we're talking about freeway removal are, of course, the traffic impacts. And one of the things that we have to look at is the difference between freeway's big advantage, which is accommodating major speed over a very long distance. Freeways are a fantastic tool in rural areas. In urban conditions, however, they can oftentimes take away as much capacity as they create. Freeways are limited by the capacity of their on and off ramps, and they create a big pipe to small pipe problem as we try to divvy up the traffic coming on and off these freeways into the urban street grid. Grids, in fact, are a very effective tool for moving a lot of traffic. Freeways inevitably create bottlenecks when they enter urban areas. So here's an example. This happens to be from Abu Dhabi, which had been on a freeway building binge. This part of the island had several freeways coming together, 18 lanes of through traffic, equaling about 36,000 vehicles per hour in terms of the capacity for throughput. This is Vancouver at the same scale. No freeways, but many, many, many small streets. About 100 lanes of through traffic on all these tiny little streets. Less capacity per lane because of stop signs and stoplights, but twice the throughput capacity of a freeway-oriented system just because there are so many small streets. Of course, as we've already spoken, freeways can have a significant real estate value impact. Freeways create value for auto-dependent, more isolated rural lands and allow them to become suburbanized. They take away real estate value alongside them and in urban areas. So one of the things that we should be very careful about is if we're investing in freeways or really any transportation infrastructure, that it creates net positive real estate value rather than simply shifting real estate value from the core of our cities to the edges of the cities, something that has clearly happened in cities like Kansas City and Detroit. There are also social impacts. While freeways have this tremendous advantage of providing convenience for cars and motorists, allowing us to get around quickly, they create significant disadvantages for other modes of transportation. Particularly for people who cannot afford a car or are disabled or too young or too old to drive. There may be significant net negative social impacts if freeways allow us to degrade mobility for our most vulnerable populations. There are many other examples. We don't have time to get into the details. Some of the most famous include Portland, Oregon's Harbor Drive. This is the before, and that's the after. Spectacular front porch for Portland, Oregon. Of course, one of the most dramatic is the Cheonggi-jeon Expressway in Seoul, South Korea. This was this major freeway cutting through the heart of the city. The freeway was removed entirely and replaced by one of the most spectacular parks really anywhere in the world, but certainly for Seoul. And after we hear from Norm, we'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Great. Jeff, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We are now going to give it to Norm, whose presentation is coming up.
Sound check, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I will say that I'm not a traffic engineer either, although I did leave the traffic engineering for Advocacy here. I work a lot with engineers and understanding engineering, and I do have engineering degrees, but I have not done the professional engineering thing. So I'm going to focus on a couple case studies primarily. The first one, I'm going to focus on checking what I'm calling here the freeway lobbies statements against their own data. I'm also starting to think of this as the freeway industrial complex, like the military industrial complex. They are very committed to what they're doing. And in the second case study, I'm going to focus on probing whether the analyses that are being done are actually trying to evaluate the benefits that we're trying to achieve. And in the end, I'm going to do a very brief summary of what you should be looking for in the analyses. So for the first case study, I'm going to take Seattle, partly because that was the focus of the previous webinar in this series. And as I think John Norquist mentioned in that, I did come in for CNU at the beginning and raised some questions that helped muddy the waters enough that everything eventually got reevaluated. And this was something that was on the Washington DOT's website about the Alaskan Way Viaduct at the time. It said, can increased transit take the place of the Alaskan Way Viaduct? And then they wrote this as the response. This was like a frequently asked questions page. And they say Washington State DOT has planned for aggressive improvements in transit, but even with increased transit ridership, travel demand on the viaduct is expected to grow. Traffic on the viaduct replacement is expected to grow from 110,000 daily vehicles today to 135,000 vehicles per day in 2030 due to growth in population and commercial activity. I'm going to stop there and pick up the rest of it later. But this is the kind of statement that you always hear. You hear this authoritative, it always has numbers, significant numbers. We're growing, we can't do anything about it, we have to accommodate this growth. And when you looked into the appendices of the environmental documentation that they'd done for this project, they said that the ramps and local arterials in the downtown showed little or no growth in vehicle travel compared to the present. So what we often see when I'm hired by groups that are questioning what departments of transportation are doing, I often find a big disconnect between their public presentation and what their own technical documentation says. So that's one thing that always should be checked, is what they're saying really have a basis in their own analyses. So I'm just going to cross that part out. And then the other part of the statement said, this forecast takes into account heavy transportation investments and also reflects a doubling of commute trips to downtown on transit, with an estimated 53% of workers in downtown commuting by transit in the year 2030. So again, we looked at their own data, and their model was off by 80% downtown. So actually, it had an 80% downtown transit share in the base model. It wasn't modeling transit accurately enough at all. So we really can conclude anything about future transit from their modeling. So we'll cross that part off too. So basically, they're just spouting information that isn't supported by their own analyses. And unfortunately, this is often the case. Often the case, you'll hear a traffic engineer or a transportation modeler say something like, the model says that traffic will double, or whatever in the future. And typically, even when the model did say that, it's largely based on the assumptions that were put in the model by people. So we have to kind of look deeper under this. For my second case study, I'm going to look at Austin, which is a project I'm involved with now. And interestingly, I don't know if those of you who are listening to National Public Radio this morning might have heard a story that's related to this project, although they didn't focus on what we're trying to do. But they had Tim Lomax of the Texas Transportation Institute on, saying that there was basically no way that Austin could build its way out of congestion. And that's really interesting because he's the one who's the main author of the urban mobility study, which is often held up as a reason why we need to invest billions and billions of dollars in increased widenings. But he was on the radio this morning saying that Austin's growing too quickly, that they can't grow out of that way. They can't build enough roads. They have to think about getting people out of their cars. and getting shorter trips, which means getting people closer to where they work. So the project we're involved with in Austin is, I think you can probably see my arrow here. This is I-35 in what used to be a park. And in Texas style, it's not just a single freeway, but there's also these frontage roads. So it's about 300 feet or more across here. So it's quite a wide thing. You can see that the downtown Austin's really booming here to the west. And East Austin is less booming to the east, and there would be gentrification issues and so forth. But it's very clear that the property values are being suppressed on the west side of the road as well. So these are the same sort of issues that Jeff was talking about, that where there would be benefits to taming this in some way. My clients haven't been ambitious enough to think that it could be removed, but they're hoping that it could be really scaled down, that it could be focused just on through traffic. You could cap it, carry some of the local traffic on top, and you could bring the buildings, therefore, right up to the roadway that remains and increase a lot of economic value. So, like what I'm seeing in a lot of other cities now, these ideas are getting enough traction that we're seeing the departments of transportation not say that they won't review these ideas at all, but that they will take them into consideration as an alternative. The problem is that they find it more or less impossible to fully take them on as an alternative. So here we have 5 key transportation principles we're trying to achieve in Austin with what's called Reconnect Austin, and they have a website. One is to offload the central Austin traffic from I-35 to the north and south and distribute that traffic into the grid to make that part of it a great walkable place, including getting across I-35. Right now, there's a lot of cheap or free parking under I-35. So the idea, a lot of use by state employees. With less parking per land use, you'd expect higher prices, and that would encourage people to drive less. We get more what's called internal capture due to higher density mixed land use in the walkable environment. And we get transit investments and an increased transit mode share. And another key idea is, and very much they're going, and I should have put it on the slide, is that they are estimating how much additional economic development they could expect and what the tax base would be increased from that. So there's a big economic component. So when DOT says that they're going to analyze this, what are they actually doing? First of all, they're unwilling to actually look at removing the central ramps there in the city. So they're still presenting something where they have a lot of entrance ramps and exit ramps along that area that Reconnect Austin is showing as capped. And not only are these ramps still existing, but they have to be more modern, which means they need to be straighter, longer, and flatter. So they take up even more space. So they're not willing to kind of analyze the project as presented. They're looking at 2025 to try and do some what they're calling short-term improvements. And then regardless of what any modeling shows, they're just going to grow the traffic by 2% per year. And that doesn't make any sense because Reconnect Austin's all about changing travel patterns. There's no reason to think that once you change the travel patterns, you need a bigger road than what you have today. And in fact, even in Austin, which has grown incredibly, the VMT per capita is declining. And if population wasn't growing so quickly, VMT would be declining. It is declining nationally. So a lot of these old forecasts of growing VMT are just out of date. In particular, young people are driving less and using other modes. 2025 is not a good year to really assess the benefits of Reconnect Austin, which involves billions of dollars of investment in new real estate. And then there's the issue about walkability. They said, well, we're going to do our thing here. And this is showing one of their alternatives where they have a sunken, wider I-35. They still have the 2 frontage roads, and you see the thing's even gotten wider. They're actually reducing access across 35 because they see that as a problem with the frontage roads moving quickly. And they said, well, later on, after we finish this, maybe we could cap it and build a park here. This is sort of a really silly park. It has this one access over here on this huge arterial, and then it's on top of this road. It's they're thinking that somehow that's what was being proposed here, but it's not at all. They're not looking at parking costs in their scenarios. They're not really looking at internal capture because they just said we're going to grow 2% per year. This is showing that with this is from San Diego region, which I think would be comparable to Austin in lots of ways. They're showing with data that when you have mixed land use with density, mixed jobs and housing, you get a lot of internal trips. And this is just a slide showing that yes, transit can help too from Portland. Once Portland started investing so much in transit, their VMT per capita began to decline while the US was still going up. So going back then, does the process that the DOT is doing, does that really properly assess Reconnect Austin? So what are we looking at? Does it include offloading the central Austin traffic and distributing the traffic into the grid? No. Does it include making central Austin a great walkable place? No. Does it include parking constraints and higher prices? No. Does it allow include calculating more internal capture? No. An increased market transit mode share? No. And it doesn't look at the economic valuation that would come from this. So while they're saying that they're participating and they're including this in the mix of scenarios, they're just not. So you need to be careful about that because, as I said, I think the last few years these ideas have gotten enough traction that the TOTs are pretending to include them in the process rather than just excluding them. So what do we need to ask for? We need to model an accurate version of teardown proposals where we actually model all the components and all the benefits that we're looking for. They have to be sensitive to land use and parking pricing, which generally means changes to the models that are used, either using a post-processing model like MXD or making the model actually sensitive to these factors. Most regional models aren't. And we need to estimate all the non-auto trips accurately. And that's all. So I think we've left a fair amount of time for questions. I know I thought there'd probably be a lot of interesting questions.
Great. Thanks, Norm. We appreciate it. Yeah, we've been getting some good questions throughout the whole process here. So I'm hoping to answer some now. If we can get Jeff's video up. And maybe, Norm, if you can mute your microphone. Great. So this is probably a question for both you, Norm, and Jeff. It's one of the last questions we got, which came from Adam Old, and he was wondering if offloading traffic into the grid decreases walkability. Jeff, do you want to comment on that, and then maybe we can have Norm take a crack at it?
So one of the fundamental problems that we face in all cities is, it's the Goldilocks problem, right? So if you've got a street that is effectively a traffic sewer designed only with motor vehicles in mind, then yes, it's going to decrease walkability. And so for many cities, the solution has been to create superblocks, to have many streets be either pedestrian only, and push traffic to the edge, or to elevate traffic above the city streets. Both of these, both the superblock as well as the elevated urban highway solution, create more problems than they solve. And so if you're going to accommodate traffic in a city, spreading it out among many small streets at a low speed, and particularly at a low speed, and that's really the most important characteristic, I think is always going to be a better solution for cities. I think the right solution becomes very different as you transition out of urban places into more suburban and particularly rural places.
Great. All right, Norm, do you want to comment? Great. Okay. So another question. So Mike Christensen wants to know, he's got a freeway in mind that he'd like to remove himself, maybe. But it's a through route. So he's wondering if there are any good case studies of placing freeways below grade in a tunnel or trench. I'm guessing similar to the Boston or the Austin concept, but I guess Boston might be an example. Jeff, do you have maybe some background on that?
Well, perhaps the most recent example is the story of the Seattle Alaskan Way Viaduct. We did a bunch of work on analyzing the removal of the viaduct and replacing it with a surface boulevard. Ultimately, there was a political decision to replace the elevated freeway with a bored tunnel underneath the city of Seattle. This decision was made despite the fact that the tunnel actually exacerbates congestion compared to either leaving the freeway where it is or replacing it with the surface boulevard, largely because of the bottleneck problem that's created at either end of the tunnel. So there's this challenge of the intersection between a limited access freeway and the urban street grid, and the need to create effectively a manifold to take that one big pipe and break it down into the many small pipes of the city street grid. So there are, it's possible to put your freeways underground. I think the core question is, what is the cost benefit? Those projects are outrageously expensive, and in Seattle's case, they effectively turned down the opportunity to create a regional metro system and instead put their money into a freeway undergrounding. So is undergrounding the freeway the highest and best use of your limited transportation infrastructure dollars in order to help your city achieve its economic development, environmental quality, social equity, and other goals? If it is, then the next thing to be very cautious of is the connection between that tunnel and the surface streets. I think another obvious example is the Big Dig in Boston, which, while it's created a dramatic improvement in that part of Boston, it's also created problems where the connections between the tunnel and the surface streets are. There are these big kind of gashes in the urban fabric, and the problem that you get of both safety and public realm quality where the freeway on and off ramps meet the city.
Norm? Great, yeah. I want to get into the idea of boulevards. CNU has this Highways to Boulevards initiative. We advocate for replacing urban freeways with boulevards. So I'd like to hear from both of you. Maybe we'll start with Norm. Why is the boulevard option so appealing? Maybe in terms of numbers and in terms of aesthetics. What have you found in that regard? Jeff, anything to
Uh,
add?
Boulevards are great, but I would agree with Norm that they're not the only solution. Another solution is simply taking advantage of the street grid and devising techniques at the edge of the city in order to break up that major flow of the big pipe into the many small pipes. Freeway removals are also one reason in some cities to justify a one-way street network. While generally I dislike one-way streets, particularly where they're trying to serve as retail streets, one of the great counterexamples is Portland, Oregon, where the downtown is predominantly one-way couplets. Each of those streets is only 2 lanes wide for the most part. But most importantly, the signals are all synchronized on downtown Portland streets for about an 11-mile-an-hour progression. What this means is that motorists never actually have to stop, provided they stay at 11 miles an hour. But it's practically impossible for a motorist to get up enough speed to kill either a pedestrian or a cyclist. And as a result, Portland's one-way street system results in it being one of the safest downtowns in the United States, almost at a European level of traffic safety, largely because they use the one-way street grid to minimize speed rather than what most US cities have done, which is to use the one-way street pattern to maximize speed and volume. The other thing that the street grid also does is it very effectively distributes the traffic heading to and from the freeway ramps that do exist in and around the edges of downtown with minimum bottleneck conditions.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So this is one of the earlier questions from Emily Bear. She's wondering, I would like to hear whether there were any real concerns specific to freight movements surrounding any of the projects or examples that the both of you talked about. I know it's common in some corridors and not others, but maybe you guys have specific examples that you could tell us about. Maybe Norm?
In any in any freeway removal or major public infrastructure project, it's really, really important to talk with the folks who have interests in freight and delivery services. They're an incredibly important part of any urban economy. Um, and so the first thing to do is to figure out who those interests are and to start collecting data. One of the things that we frequently find, really in all aspects of transportation, is people will make emphatic statements without regard to actual empirical data. And so getting real numbers about what are the patterns for freight delivery, what of it is related to core economic clusters in the city. So in Seattle, still has a lot of manufacturing that is incredibly important to them. So there we were able to sort of separate out the core industries that for whom delay would be a significant issue, from secondary industries that were more time flexible to other services like FedEx delivery that is a entirely different case and can be managed in different ways. So having clear data and then running the numbers and figuring out what you need to do in order to protect freight delivery time. In fact, in many ways, it is a lot easier to protect freight delivery on city streets because municipalities are better capable of providing priority to freight than the USDOT or oftentimes state governments. So in the case of Seattle, there were many things that the municipality and the port did in order to create freight-only connections to some of the regional transportation infrastructure, as well as to facilitate rail travel times in order to allow some truck freight traffic to be shifted to rail. So I think the answer is get real information about the entirety of the situation and solve the problem just as you would solve any other problem.
Yeah, and I think Norm would agree with that. It's all about better information, right? I know Norm, he's a leader of the Transportation Modeling Reform Group within CNU, and he's really working towards making better models. And he mentioned it in his presentation about traffic engineers using old forecasts when really they should be using more accurate data, right? There's a question that we had from Eric Doherty, and he said that he's interested in reducing vehicle miles traveled and also greenhouse gas emissions. And he was saying that with the high capacity of the street grid, it almost seems like both removing a freeway and reallocating some of the road space to transit or cycling is necessary to make these reductions. Do you guys agree with this or disagree? Norm, maybe you first. Cool. Jeff, do you have a comment?
There we go. All right, now I'm talking. Yes, so there are Many things that we need to do in order to bring our mobility and greenhouse gas reduction goals into alignment. Here in California, we have the blessing of the California Environmental Quality Act, which, at least insofar as the transportation analysis conventions are concerned, I would argue has created more harm to the California environment than any other regulation, largely because of CEQA's fixation on intersection level of service and the way the courts have wanted analyses to be conservative. Therefore, we have to overestimate vehicle demand in any new development and then over accommodate that vehicle demand by building infrastructure in order to provide more than the worst case scenario for automobile trip generation. California also has the strictest regulations in terms of greenhouse gas reduction and vehicle miles traveled reduction goals. And so the Environmental Quality Act and our greenhouse gas reduction requirements are in complete contradiction to each other. Fortunately, the state has been very busy trying to remove those contradictions, including eliminating level of service as an analysis criterion, at least for transit-intensive areas. It's a first step. We're also working on requiring that statewide or regional level transportation analyses for infrastructure think about induced demand and also make sure that in any transportation investment that we do not allow an increase in per capita vehicle miles traveled, or more importantly, that any transportation project helps to fulfill the local or regional goal for per capita vehicle miles traveled reduction. If you want to have a sophisticated conversation about overall urban mobility and the role of freeways, it's critically important to change the analytical tools, as Norm was talking about, but just as importantly, to better vision for more economically successful, livable, ecologically sustainable, and socially equitable communities. All that said, because of the scale of freeway infrastructure, I'm rather skeptical about its usefulness for shifting towards other modes, except for long distance sort of bus rapid transit, suburban commuter shuttle sort of facilities. In which case, converting existing lanes either to high occupancy toll lanes or simply high occupancy vehicle lanes helps us to be able to provide speed and reliability to public transit on our major freeway facilities until such a day comes when we stop using the Soviet communist approach of managing our transportation system and suffering with the same problem that the Soviets ran into with that kind of command and control economy and underpricing of public goods, which is congestion. So I think we've all recognized that we can't build our way out of congestion. The best that we can do is manage our systems. We also recognize that in the United States, we still confuse our constitutional right to our freedom of movement with the actual political non-starter.
Great. Okay. We got a good question in from Tim Raymond, and I was actually wanting to bring this up as well. So he was thinking, so once a decision has been made to remove these expressways, how can advocates work to ensure that the new design is appropriate and not a new form of overscaled traffic sewer, as he put in quotations? It's something that some advocates have said has happened in New Haven, for example, or with the West Shoreway in Cleveland. Norm, do you have any ways that that advocates can ensure that it's properly scaled, the new design alternative is properly scaled?
let me just emphasize what Norm was saying. The number one priority right now for any transportation and livable communities advocate should be getting your local jurisdiction, which means your municipality, your county, and your state Department of Transportation, to adopt new design manuals. And specifically, the NACTO, as Norm mentioned, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, recently released this year its Urban Street Design Guide. It's available free for all of you to download at nacto.org. And municipalities and states around the country have started the process of actually adopting this manual so that good design is done from the beginning rather than through an elaborate exceptions process. Right now, in almost all states and municipalities in the United States, our urban street design approaches are based upon rural highway research and design intent. And it's the worst thing that we could possibly do for either livable communities or safe communities. In order to solve that problem, get your jurisdictions to adopt the NACTO guides or the ITE CNU guide or both, and to have an affirmative statement that says that the highway design guidance is appropriate only in rural areas, and the primary design guidance for urban areas is either NACTO or ITE, and I think NACTO is it's more thorough. So once you have that in place, then it becomes a lot easier. Then the local engineers can't say, well, the standard says the lane needs to be 14 feet wide. How can you be saying that the state highway transportation officials policy on the geometric design of highway and roads, which is what we call the Green Book? That tome of a book offers a tremendous amount of flexibility. But for some reason in the traffic engineering world, engineers have been taught to default to the largest allowable dimension rather than the tightest appropriate dimension. So go read ACTO and lobby to get your city and your county and your state to adopt it. Washington State adopted it yesterday.
Yeah, that's good advice. I put both links for both manuals in the chat feature. So if you guys want to check those out, it's a really good comment. I would ask then how, once these design manuals are voted on, agreed upon, how do we get traffic engineers then to use them? Jeff, how do we?
Engineers, one of the things about engineers that I think a lot of people misunderstand is that for the most part, what motivates engineers is they like to build stuff. That's why they got into engineering to begin with, and nothing makes them happier than getting stuff built. For the most part, engineers are not given very good training in how to involve the public. Their task is to come up with a technical solution. So one of the things that has made many of us frustrated with our local traffic engineers is that the policies, regulations, and guidelines that they have been given, that they have to abide by, and if they don't abide by those, they can lose their professional certification, and they could be made personally liable for for crashes that happen on roadways that they signed off on. So the price for non-conformance with regulations and guidelines among traffic engineers is very, very high. If you change the rules and then help your local engineers figure out how to actually get their project through the design process and forward to completion, your local engineers will be your best friends. I assure you, many of them are actually very, very nice people. Treat them with respect and help them get their projects built.
Norm, do you agree that we should treat traffic engineers with respect? All right, great. Well, I just wanted to have one more question for the both of you. Wondering, again, a lot of the people on this webinar are advocates. Again, they're not traffic engineers. They're just people who see a problem in their city. They see a freeway for what it takes to remove a freeway and the streets. And I just wondered what kind of take-home message, what is your last comment, I guess, for these advocates who are probably a lot of them engaged in their own campaigns right now? What is the best advice that you can give them? Maybe we'll go to Jeff first and then Norm.
So the first thing I would advise is to educate yourself. Go and read, at the very least, some of the more recent manuals, because they are written in language that actual normal human beings can understand. So understand about our profession in order to make yourself more credible and more effective in your arguments. The next thing to do is to, rather than beating yourself up fighting one small project after another, spend your time on changing the rules. Fix the DNA, adopt the right design manual, and adopt the right transportation performance metrics, and make sure that your community is using smart transportation analysis tools. That's my recommendation.
Norm? All right, well, I think with that, we will leave it. I want to thank both Norm Marshall of Smart Mobility and Jeff Tumlin of Nelson Nygaard for joining us today. It was wonderful. You gave us so much useful information. We will be back in the new year with some brand new webinars. So I just want to thank, again, everyone for joining us. Jeff and Norm, we really appreciate it. Happy holidays, everyone, and we'll see you again next year. Thanks.